What's up, y'all? We are back with another Staff and FaculTEA Sessions podcast. I am your co-host, Chelsea. She, her, Aya are my pronouns.
And I'm Anna, and my pronouns are also she, her, Aya. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you for joining us again.
We've been having, again, so many amazing stories submitted and so many amazing conversations with y'all. That we're feeling really grounded. Anna and I were just talking earlier about like this being part of our purpose. Your comments on our various platforms, just saying that you feel affirmed and you've been waiting for somebody to talk about this.
That's why we're doing it.
Affirms us.
Yeah. So thank you for your support, and we are excited to be received in this way because, yeah, part of the reason we started this is because we also felt like we needed to not feel crazy for a minute, and just be like, okay, so we are not the ones that are fucked up over here.
Yeah. And I had this cheesy moment the other day where I was like listening to a song that was like a really heartbreaking sort of love song. And I thought about like and I'm not calling myself an artist, so let's not get that twisted. But, every artist that I've known or every creator, their best work happens in times of pain, in times of grief, where they're, searching for an outlet for all of that. And I really think, this is part of at least I won't speak for Anna, but this is part of my grief process, that like we're being very vulnerable and sort of spilling this in a way to share that with you and in a way to grieve and to heal ourselves and the dreams that we had for some of these institutions.
And I think it's important, and we've said it before, but we are having these discussions because we care about the field. We care about our students. We care about our colleagues. We see the problems. And this is one of the ways that we are trying to bring forth solutions, because part of the issue is we know secrets keep us sick.
Yeah.
And so by exposing some of these secrets and kind of this hidden, happenings that are going on in higher ed, it at least gets the conversation going.
The key not to gossip, but to transform.
Yeah.
And we had a really great conversation. One of our story submitter badasses actually brought it up, and we talk about this a lot as like the even the concept of gossip, right? And how weaponized that's been in terms of making it gendered and making it so talking real talk and talking about abuses and talking about wage inequity. I mean, I remember that moment so clearly in the area that we were just in, where it was like, you don't talk about what's happening here outside of this office.
Don't talk to each other. Don't talk to anyone else.
Don't talk to each other.
Everyone's on their own journey.
And you'll get in trouble for talking to each other. And if you talk about what's happening up here, you're really going to get in trouble. And I was like, my whole body froze because I was like, that's what abusers say. That's what abusers do, right? And that's what was happening. So especially for women, non-cishet men, gossiping is a way that we share information as a survival technique.
Yeah.
We're seeking safety, right? So this is one way that we share what's really going on.
We want to start the episode by taking a moment to honor Jonathan Joss, who was murdered as a hate crime.
Yeah.
At the start of Pride Month. And yeah, that hits really deep.
Yeah.
It's a devastating loss. This happened in front of his husband. And the news coverage has left a lot of information out. And so we think it's important to make sure that we are using the accurate terminology of murder motivated by hate, because this is the world we're living in.
Again, when we're talking about truth-telling, right? The first instinct of the police department was to release a statement saying, basically, this is not a hate crime. According to our investigation thus far, we're talking about one day in, right? So juxtaposing that with higher ed, right? That immediate, like, I'm going to defend the institution or, but like all those layers of violence, right? And inflicted on two gay men and Indigenous folks, right? So that's not by accident either. When we think about the grief there, we think about, Palestine, right? And just all the violence that is intrinsic to First Nations peoples. And
yeah, so we're just bringing it into the room because it is weighing heavy on us, and it is going to affect the way that we are engaging in our topic today.
part of what we're trying to do is still find, those moments, right, where we're really moving with our principles, right, our politic, and trying to find some levity in all the things that are happening in the world,
As we call it, traumedy
hour. It's a coping mechanism, right, for people that have experienced trauma and continue to experience trauma. So we want to make sure that we're not making light of anything that we're talking about and the subject matter today. We really want to make sure that we're talking about this in a way where we're speaking from our own experiences, we're speaking from what we've seen, and that doesn't get weaponized, right, in a way that says, well, you can't criticize this thing because it's under attack. And you're like,
Yeah.
People are under attack, right? People are under attack all over the world. And that's why this is so important. Again, just speaking truth to power.
Yeah. Yeah. And so for today's topic, we are going to be focusing in on DEI work in higher education and connecting what's happening in those spaces to the fascism that is present in our greater American landscape and global landscape. Because across the world, fascist parties are winning elections, and that's terrifying. So yeah, we think it's important to name all of these things and say all of these things out loud and publicly, because we need to be working in solidarity to resist. We are all in danger.
Yeah. And just thinking about how this shows up on our campuses, right? I think there's a lot of authoritarianism that is showing up on college campuses right now from the good white liberals, right? Or people that are trying to get proximity to whiteness because that means power, right? That means safety, like whatever people think that means, wherever they're operating from. We're really seeing now just like the surveillance, the silencing of dissent, the
micromanagement.
It's just layers on layers, right? Of things that are not in service of students, are not in service of our purpose, our mission and vision, the things we actually say that we're there to do, the things we're funded to do. So I think we want to unpack that a little bit. So we've had all these really amazing interviews, and we see all these themes that are coming up, right? And then I have done a lot of facilitation work. First, we always know, like, to set kind of the conditions for a conversation, you have to kind of create a common language and a common understanding of what you're talking about. So today we're going to be talking about this from that perspective, but then we're going to do a deeper dive on the actual stories, the interviews that we've had that have informed this conversation.
Yeah. So our goal is really just to contextualize what we're going to be covering in those stories and making sure that we're working off of common understandings of terms that we're going to be using and happenings that we're going to be alluding to and talking about, so that we can all be on the same page as we dive into the deeper nitty-gritty stuff that came out in those interviews. So thank you again to everyone who has shared their stories with us. And I also just want to validate the pain that y'all have shared with us. And so, yeah, we hope that you're connecting with the content and with each other. And we hope to increase the engagement with our social media and our community, because really that is the big picture goal too, is we want to create a place where people feel comfortable saying the truth and advocating for themselves and for each other, and just validating each other, because it's hard to find those spaces. Yeah.
And the conversations that we've had, like, in the recent weeks, right? Shit that has just been so outlandish. Like ICE snatching children and parents off the streets, right? That people are finding a way to normalize that, right? And this is what that looks like, right? So really pushing the envelope when we think about, what is legal, right?
We've had this discussion before.
Just like sharing, like, all this wild shit is happening, and it's not just happening to me. even though you are enough, right? That like, even if you have multiple examples, you're talking about the bar being hell, like that bar is hell, right? That
Well, it's actually heaven because it's so high, it's hard to reach it.
crazy. So just thinking about like, again, affirming people in if they file reports or they do this or they do that, none of those things work, right? It's because they tell you to go through all the proper channels because they control them and they know it won't work. So again, kind of creating that conversation around like what's happening in our country, what's happening in our world, that like violence that's legalized, right? That abuse that's legalized, that is occurring in higher ed every day as well, right? So we're going to get into it.
We're going to get into it.
Okay. So DEI, sometimes we have the A, right? We really want to like center access, accessibility, right? When we think about what's happening, again, the attacks on folks with disabilities, how much erasure there is in DEI work and equity work on campuses around students with disabilities and people, you know, workers with disabilities that need support, that need accommodations. So I think we're going to do the dive into that and just talk about like the abuses that are also happening in DEI spaces, the ways in which so many of our institutions are so entrenched in the status quo, right? And this is the way we've always done things, or this is how we do things here. Actual quote.
Which I'm sure you all have heard because I heard it everywhere I worked.
Yep.
I don't think that's a special thing.
Yep.
And also, I think the fact that whiteness is centered in DEI work and the shift that's happening as things are being branded differently now, especially under this new fascist regime that has taken over the US government, and thinking about, just how they're trying to redefine what DEI means and who is to be served. And it just makes things very interesting to navigate as we exist in these positions where, that's our goal, to try to support the most marginalized communities and make sure that the access is present and that the support is present. And now, budgets are getting cut and there's attacks coming from all over the media. Our political parties are Republican light and alt-right. We don't have a truly
leftist party in the US.
Yeah.
No, there's no way.
Yeah.
And, modern day Democrats have become the Republicans of old. And again, a lot of our campus leaders, are moving the same way. Look at what's happened to Gavin Newsom. Like,
who is that?
Who is that guy, first of all, right? And again, handsome, wealthy white guy, like, how could we expect anything different, right? But that push, right, to be like weaponizing inclusivity, right? The like, well, what does it all mean if we don't include and embrace like the far right people who want to exterminate everybody who's not like, who doesn't look like me? And we want to entertain those ideas and hear them out. It's like, no, we fucking don't. And they actually wrote a playbook. It's been a playbook since the beginning of time. And then they actually wrote it down in Project 2025.
Again, because it's been written.
Thinking about how many of our people are like moving, in bad faith, thinking about having those conversations with leaders in a DEI space saying like, well, what about the white kids? Like, why aren't the white kids showing up when in fact the white kids were showing up? So that in and of itself was just not true. Just that, like that pull, right? That status quo pull, that proximity to whiteness pull, what white supremacy looks like in workspaces, right? And that everybody is subject to it because like so many of us that grew up in this country, right? You had to do the pledge every day. Think about that shit. The ways in which we are, again, sort of trained and programmed
through propaganda,
the attacks on ethnic studies right now, right? But man, it's just entrenched in every system, but people are not talking enough about what it looks like in higher ed, in spaces that claim to be all about DEI and equity. We're not talking about the right-leaning institutions and leadership because we know what that looks like, right? That's like doing an SNL episode on Donald Trump. Like, this is like Life is One Big Onion article. We're talking about the spaces that claim to be about it. It's really important to just unpack that because you might be experiencing this right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the things that really prompted us to connect with this topic so much is how we have seen and lived and learned about so many of these different, I guess, happenings in DEI spaces. And for me, it just really brings up the concepts of like what I get punished for when I speak up and what somebody else gets rewarded for, often by stealing my message, my words. They're rewarded and I'm punished.
Yeah.
And there's not enough conversation around how that affects the work that we do, especially in these DEI offices. And I think typically DEI offices tend to have more diversity in terms of like racial identity and maybe sexual orientation and or gender. And I guess some of the messiness that we want to get into is how all of that gets sold and packaged in a certain way, and then the reality of how it's working in the background.
Yeah.
And thinking about how sometimes folks of color and folks of other marginalized backgrounds who are in these spaces taking leadership roles, taking space, can sometimes be more harmful if they're not in alignment with what should be grounding DEI movements, right? Like actual justice, actual equity, not here to perform for the white folks, to make them feel better. It's DEI work is meant to change material conditions for those folks who have been marginalized and pushed out by systems that are working exactly as they were designed. And so that also kind of made me think about your comments around the HR piece and HR not being your friend and how they'll tell you report it and then they'll investigate themselves and nothing happened. You're wrong. It was just, little miscommunications. Yeah. There's a lot of juiciness in that mess that we really need to bring out and discuss because I think it creates a dynamic that makes it difficult to address.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't want to go and speak to people who are in marginalized communities and check them on their harm.
Yeah.
The harm that they're perpetuating
Yeah.
when they're doing this work in misaligned ways.
Yeah.
Right? That creates a dynamic that is problematic, especially if it's happening in spaces that are public.
Yeah.
Right? Like I'm down to have that conversation.
Yep.
On a one-on-one in a small group.
Yep.
Even if it's not necessarily a trusted person. But I think the issues come up when these discussions are happening in more open settings and having people saying some crazy ass shit.
Yeah.
And being like, how do I navigate this? It's complex.
Yeah.
Right? Like it leaves me speechless. I don't know.
Yeah. And again, how that gets weaponized by the right or weaponized by people who aren't acting in good faith, right? That there's a certain way, again, when we talk about the status quo, when we talk about like professionalism steeped in white supremacy, right? There's a certain way that you're supposed to show up and talk about the things, and these are all the like coded words that we want to use, and you can't call a thing. And how much like our fear of disruption, right? For me, I'm like, man, I want like double DEIAJ, because I want disruption to be in there because nothing new can grow, nothing productive can happen until we disrupt that colonial soil these institutions were built on to actually exclude people, right? People in the margins. And folks really kind of doubling down on that, right? With the attacks on affirmative action, which white women have benefited from affirmative action more than anybody else. So when white women align themselves with white men, right? Not only are you harming every other person, that you're harming yourself too.
Yeah.
And thinking about like how so much of this is dependent on funding and funders, right? There was a whole article that came out connected to the nonprofit industrial complex, but thinking about like,
well, higher ed is the same thing.
Same thing, right? That you're sort of at the whim of funders, right? So we used to joke about it because it was just so wild that folks that were in areas where like that was their specialty, right? The work that they were doing every day, they were experts in their field. And for me, say like working with student parents, right? That there were grants that were being written and there were all these things that people were going out for. And there was all this conversation. I kept like yelling about childcare, especially with COVID and the safety net collapsing. And I can't even get into the room to have the conversation about maybe some solutions to those problems, because there was a whole group of administrators who weren't doing the work and didn't have lived or learned experience in that area. So when you think about, you know, the urgency, right? And not urgency in that like white supremacist context, but urgency in like, you know, students, especially women of color, women in the margins can't step into that classroom. They are an excluded group, right? They can't step into the classroom until they can step into their child's preschool classroom. So how can we fix what's broken? And we can't even get into the room, you know, and Anna, again, continuing to say things and champion things. And then you see somebody else that is profiting off the things that you did and said. Where is that coming from, right? Why are so many of our people operating out of self-interest, right? Why are so many of the ICE agents brown? And just like all that harm that capitalism has done to us, that colonialism has done to us, that if we're not interrogating that every day, we're not doing the work. If we're not interrogating that and how it shows up in ourselves, right? Some of the best work that I ever had the privilege of doing is just being in community organizing spaces where I had to interrogate my own shit all the time. It's the only way to grow, and it's painful. But you look at everything that's at stake and like, man, we still can't even talk about the genocide that's happening, you know, but we just did a land acknowledgement and I'm so confused, you know?
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance is real.
It's real.
And I guess that's really what we want to call out in this episode is the performative DEI and why is that priority, right? And I think it connects to what you were saying around the funding. And I've been sitting a lot with the concept of martyrdom for me, you know, and what I see in many of my colleagues who are oftentimes nervous system dysregulated, are having a hard time figuring out a pathway out of the madness and the pain and the harm that's happening. And how oftentimes, you know, we're lacking boundaries. And so we choose things that are harmful to us, that are sometimes harmful to others. And a lot of times I really believe it's not the intention, right? Like I want to believe that most people aren't purposefully going out of their way. Are there people who are doing that? Absolutely. I believe that people are harmed and we haven't created a society that allows us to really engage with that in a healthy way, right? I had a conversation with another colleague the other day, and she was talking about her healing journey. And, you know, part of it included relationships. And, you know, she's a woman who dates men, and the man, you know, was doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. And when she finally like held her boundary with that, he kind of just shut off, right? And like literally compartmentalized it so hard and was like, okay, never talking about that again. I guess you're out of my life, right? And so we talked about like, what would it look like if we could rebrand being a strong man? And what that looks like, right? What if instead of looking at manhood as like the literal muscles, right? And stoic, emotionless, unbothered by any of the stuff. Because if we really take a look at the dynamics that are present across the board, it doesn't matter what industry we're talking about. I mean, look at our government as a prime example. People always talk about how women are so emotional and irrational and all this stuff, right? But if you engage with men who have not done their work to heal those parts of themselves, they end up becoming super harmful. And it's because they have so much pain and so much trauma that they have not been given space to, metabolize, that it's just sitting there like a constant stabbing pain, that kind of knee-jerk reaction. Nervous system is dysregulated. I literally don't know what to do. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit people.
Yeah.
I'm going to kill people. I'm going to essay people. And it's all this like power, desire to control other people because you are experiencing all of this shit.
Empowerment.
Yeah.
Right? Anger is hurt's bodyguard.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
That's so deep. And I think about replacement theory, right? What's happening with white men. It's like, we will not be replaced. And it's like, who the fuck? It's like when Chris Rock was like, if y'all are losing, who's winning? You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's the point,
that they
right?
know that, and they know that sort of the world is moving past whatever, even the smashing of gender binaries, right? They're not ready for that, and they can't get ready for it because it's challenges their masculinity, right? Which hurts them too.
Yeah, exactly.
And I also think about that when a lot of the people that we've talked to and their stories and some of our stories with people who maybe have been in higher ed for a very long time, any industry really. But when you think about higher ed, being in a place that's all about learning, right? Like, our mission statements are saying that we're like preparing the world for the next, whatever the fuck, visionary for the world that's to come for our students, right? But we are not willing to evolve and move past our own shit, And so I remember reading a whole article about equity when that language started becoming normalized. And it was like, equity is the new coconut water. It's so refreshing. It's like people love talking about equity in these like, really
academic.
It's academic, and that so many of the folks that are in higher ed that have been there for a long time, maybe that are the careerists, right? Who have moved up by not being disruptive, right? And are really just entrenched in whatever their vision of things. And that comes from our own lived and learned experiences. We've all done it. I'm coming from my own experience, right? So I have to unlearn a lot of stuff to be able to step into somebody else's reality. And I think that's what's troubling about a lot of what's happening in higher ed is like you see a lot of older folks that maybe grew up in generations where things look different. I also can't not say that every person that we've met with has been a woman and gender nonconforming folks, right? So thinking about, we haven't spoken to one man. I would love to change that. So men, like, start telling the damn truth about some of the things, even if you're the one that's perpetrated harm. Like, we would love to do that. That's what restorative justice looks like, right? But that, we're meeting with younger folks overwhelmingly, right, that are experiencing this really nasty harm from older supervisors, administrators that are just so entrenched in their shit, and then get called in or called out on it and double down. And especially when we're talking about DEI offices, like we're talking about DEI right now, which is supposed to be, us imagining a world that doesn't exist yet. And they're like, no, this world is just fine with me. Like, bro, I'm making like $250K. Like, I'm good, right? So thinking about those class implications, like all that stuff. And all this work is about, like, what are you willing to risk? And for those who really take risks, there's no payoff for that.
Here we are creating a podcast because we can't get jobs anywhere.
A bitch is
I'm just kidding. We haven't looked. We don't want these jobs.
Like, just unpacking that in your mind is just a lot.
I always say I've never understood the desire to not learn while working in a learning institution. I've never met more people who don't want to learn than people who work in higher ed.
Yeah. And like do the trainings, right? It's like, oh, we just spent, $140,000 on this training, but they don't want to operationalize it because it requires too much vulnerability and it requires us to all acknowledge the ways that we have fucked up.
And
every day we all make mistakes every day. Are you willing to be accountable and to repair? Are we willing to talk about that stuff and be like, hey, I did this thing that harmed you and I'm sorry. These are the things we require of our children.
And I think that's the thing that we want to get to, the messiness of it all, right? Like, we are not trying to cancel people. This is not about cancel culture. This is about restorative justice. It's about exposing the things that are really happening and addressing those in meaningful ways that actually hopefully lead to some sort of repair. Because, like, that's the other thing, right? We don't all have to be friends. I don't have to like you. Yep. We don't have to hang out outside of work. I will treat you with basic human dignity and respect because we all deserve that. And I deserve to say, hey, you've hurt me when you've done it this way, and you deserve to tell me the same thing. And we should be able to engage in that conversation, right? Yeah. And I think about how this really sits so deeply in especially the folks that are drawn to the power, that are drawn to the, career and the moving up and kind of being promoted and all of that, and how the way that the system is currently set up creates a dynamic where people are not encouraged to reflect, are not encouraged to accept responsibility, to acknowledge when they've created a harmful situation, program, training, whatever, because there's this fear that ownership of that or admitting that you've done something wrong is going to harm you in the long run, right? And so then it creates this separation of people who are actually living in their values, that see what happens as people move up these ranks. I'll talk about myself as an example. I think I would be a great administrator, if I'm being honest, right? Like, I really do. Do I want to be in that space? No, because you know what I think would happen to me? I would get eaten by the system. I think about this there was an article I read so long ago, and I've had a hard time finding it, so I don't know where it is. And I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, but it might have been Forbes or something. And it was interviewing a bunch of young folks who had gone into working on Wall Street because they wanted to burn it down from the inside. Yeah. All of the people they interviewed, that's where they started. And then they were just eaten by the system and became a cog in that system. Yep. And like, that's terrifying. And how do we address that?
We have to destroy capitalism as a
so easy.
Duh. Well, I'm thinking generationally, like, where young people are like, I can't even live. Like, I literally can't even afford to live.
Well, people compare.
Yeah.
And it's not comparable.
Yeah.
Like,
and so, so I was thinking about how, like, every generation I feel like has, like, less fucks, like, in terms of actually tolerating harmful and abusive environments. And you're a generation below me. And then we have, another very close friend that's a little older than I am, but, Gen X, again, that scarcity of being a single mom. Like, I wanted a career. I wanted to be safe. I was seeking safety. And that mind, where you realize, like, there is nothing safe about this. And it doesn't matter how much I do, because the power hoarders are going to power hoard and the narcs are going to narc, and, like, everybody has their role. And if you can't or don't want to navigate that in a way that your dignity, your self-worth, all that stuff, if you don't want to be the chameleon that can exist in all those spaces, and we can, right? Like, we can show up and I can say the right things, and I've got, the complexion for the protection and all those things, right? I don't want to, because it's an actual affront to who I am and to what my values are. So I think about how many people are really like, I came here to do this thing, and I'm trying to do that thing, and I'm trying to hold strong, and I don't understand what's happening, that misalignment that we keep talking about, right? And it's just so deep. Like, I'm feeling it in my body right now, because we've had so many conversations over the last week where, like, the pain is so palpable. It's so
it feels
hard,
overwhelming.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's why I posed that question, where to even start.
Yeah.
to address this, right? It's overwhelming. And when you're at an institution where, you know, the authoritarianism is taking hold, there's already, I mean, higher ed in general is already siloed, right? And I think, again, this works across industries, but we know higher ed is siloed. Often what is that saying about like the right hand not talking to the left hand and, you know, duplicating things all the time, where we could really be working in more collaborative ways to better serve the students that we're supposed to be serving, and how when that is actively being removed from the possibility, you get in trouble for reaching out to somebody without allowing your supervisor to be the one to do that, right? And it's like, I'm a grown-ass woman.
Yeah. Or your supervisor that hasn't responded to like your last 5 emails. You're like, well, damn, you know, I've met with this student 3 times, and this is not for, you know, a lack of planning on anything like that. Like, this student has an urgent need that we can and need to address. And so just thinking about, again, like, what place are people coming from when that becomes offensive? But that I'm like, yo, like, I've sent multiple emails. You know, this student really needs this thing. And again, I'm sitting there like, bro, this is in my job description that I'm supposed to be here to advocate for this student.
And the policies that we make. That was the thing that came up for me. It was the freaking HSI. That's what my experience is. And I know that there are a lot of other grants that are related to identities. I just haven't worked at an institution that has had any of those except for HSI. So that's where my experience is going to come from. But I think that's the thing that I think about, right? So you get literal millions of dollars for something that was written usually by people that are not part of the culture that you're trying to serve. And then the way that that money is allocated comes with all these strings. And oftentimes one of those strings is you can't give anything directly to a student. Like, you can't buy them a book. You can't buy them a computer. Like, all of these things that we know our students are struggling with. I cannot tell you how many students in my classes do all of their homework from their phones. That is wild, to not be able to purchase a computer for a student when we have millions of dollars that get spent literally on paying faculty and staff to go through trainings, you know, that get spent on all this other bullshit, when in reality, like, we could be using that money to create support systems and freaking infrastructure to support the actual needs of students that we know are the actual barriers. They don't care that I went to a training.
Yeah.
And usually when most of us go to a training, we aren't really learning how to operationalize that either.
No, and for some folks in the system, and this is where a lot of those sort of lines, you know, around class get drawn. It's like, you know, faculty, you know, get a stipend to go to that training. They get a stipend to be on that committee. They get release time. They do it in between semesters, right? Whereas a staff member, I'm there just like trying to keep my head above water.
If you're even allowed to go.
And yeah, I'm usually not. I mean, until recently, we weren't included in any of them. And I'm sure that's true for a lot of staff. So thinking about those cycles of harm too, where we talk about what we intend to do. And if you're thinking about going to the HSI piece, right? Man, like, we're not talking about what's happening to Latina folks and the diaspora, like all of that. We're not talking about the attacks, you know, oh, we'll go to this, you know, one person for some support or know your rights. Like, we are so far beyond know your rights. Ain't no rights.
They don't care. There's no rights.
So even that piece, like, what are the actual things that we're confronting, and how do we get people on board to like put in work, you know? But all that is too confrontational, right? It goes back to the civility piece. Like, you know, I can't shout down the ICE officer that walks onto campus, you know? I have to go through all these other people that, like, who knows how they're going to handle it. And I don't have faith in the system because I've seen what the system does, right? Always on James Baldwin. Like, I don't believe what you say because I see what you do. And so also that piece of, again, acknowledging the generational trauma of a lot of those folks, you know, in those positions, right? That oftentimes what we're taught, our trauma response is avoidance. So there's a lot of people where you don't want to have the hard conversation, but then you like operate in a way that's very passive aggressive or something like that. and things just pile up until they explode. And that's so much of what has happened in this country, right? That we just let systems of harm and the space in between you and I, right? The people that are operating in ways that are going to keep, Black and brown folks separate, right? So those divisions, who benefits from that, right? And how much of that gets entrenched in why we can't fix any of this shit. We need to have some really hard conversations
and decenter
ourselves and take some, accountability for, especially for folks in power, right? Like the harm that you can create by avoiding my 5 emails, because it's not just that one student that I'm advocating for that thing for, right? It's all the other students that are going to walk in the door after. And now we have a system to fix this barrier.
It's all performative. And I think that's the crux of the issue.
Yeah.
There is no desire to actually serve students. There is no desire to actually change the circumstances. What people are looking to do is to check the box and say, we did this program. It's okay that only 5 students came because they're all working, but we did the program, right? Or we hosted the ceremony. And again, those things are important, but is that really where our priorities need to be when we're existing in a world that is literally getting harder and harder to just exist in? I mean, we've had people literally being kidnapped in the streets, at schools, at their jobs, all of these places, right? And props to San Diego. They said, not here. Get the fuck out of here.
Minneapolis
and Boston. And so people are rising, and that's beautiful to see. And it's like, why does it take things coming apart so deeply to be the motivation to step into action? I keep reflecting on all the fucking checkpoints that we've had on the way to fascism that people could have stepped in and said, hey, this isn't good. Like, let's figure out how we can adjust that. And like, I see the connection. I think that's the other thing is, and it comes back to capitalism. We have been isolated. We have been programmed to think about life as myself, as an individual. How does this benefit me? And in this really like competitive way, everything in our system has shifted. The schooling system was designed by billionaires during the Industrial Revolution to basically teach young people how to sit and do menial tasks for 8 hours a day, because that's what you are going to be doing. You are going to go be a factory worker to make me money. And so I need to train you on how to do that.
And I'm going to send you home with homework so you can do more uncompensated labor after you labor, even though all the data like proves that doesn't actually change anything. Like you're learning. It just takes time away from your ability to have a life.
The 8-hour work day, 5 days a week. That was also invented to keep people in line, to prepare people to acquiesce to the things that we, as the billionaire ruling class, need to maintain our status. And what we need is worker bees. Right? Now people are talking about all of these things are connected to one thing, and that is the profit of the 1%. And making sure that we maintain that status quo so that they continue living their best lives. We're all fucking exhausted, so we can't even take a minute to like reflect and be like, wait, this doesn't feel great. Instead, they put all this pressure on you to say, build your career, make sure that you're creating your legacy, right? And like all these things. And so then, especially in America, your identity becomes so intertwined with your work. And then throw on top of that being in a helping profession or civil service. And they always talk about, oh well, we don't have funding for that, so we need volunteers for this, or we need check your emails when you're not at work because a student might be the thing, right? And so again, this brings me back to that concept of like setting up the structure so that only those that are showing up as martyrs and sacrificing their boundaries, sacrificing their wellness, sacrificing their families, all of these things, those are the people that are, I don't even know what language I want to use for this, but like those are the people who are being somewhat rewarded in this process. If you set a boundary, now you're difficult. We're going to put you on a improvement plan, or we're going to give you a warning, or we're going to write you up because you're getting a little too feisty. You're advocating for yourself a little too much. Oh, and you're talking to your friend and now she's trying to get feisty. This is not going to work. You're fired. You know?
So again, that culture of authoritarianism, right? That you can't talk about what's going on.
No dissent.
You can't tell the truth. And I think towards the end of my career, that was really what was like maddening for me.
The end of her career.
For now. But yeah, I mean, my higher ed, it was like, because I told you so. And I'm like, okay, but all the data suggests this. All the students have said this, all this and this. And it's like, you're clearly making a decision from a place that isn't aligned with what we know to be true, right?
And how many times are we not even collecting
and
data?
That was so dangerous to ask questions. It was so dangerous to say, like, well, why are we moving in that direction? You think about all the people that are being pulled, you know, going back to what you were saying about who benefits, all the people that are being like violently pulled into like inhumane office buildings and spaces where the only reason that's happening is because those buildings are sitting empty and the billionaire class needs you to start paying rent again. Or again, things might collapse. And what do we do in these institutions of higher learning? These institutions that are supposed to be engaged in like the scientific process of inquiry, right? Like, okay, let's keep doing this and we're going to try this thing, but like really try it. We're not going to just like do a training and because there's a movement happening, but we just are going to check it off as a moment, right? We're going to do this training and we're going to create this thing and we're going to build this program, but we're not going to staff the program. We're not going to actually support the program. We're going to interrogate the people that have the lived and learned experience to do that work, right? To where they just are, you know, puddles of their former selves, right?
Because that's what they need us to be. They need us to be disconnected from our bodies. They need us to be disconnected from our needs. They need us to normalize overriding what we know to be true. And this is why it works. I saw a video yesterday that was so impactful. There was a white presenting young person who posted something and was like, I don't know if you all knew this already or not, but I'm reading this book and I just learned that like the 3 meals a day is white supremacy. And like, you know, talking a little bit about that, do your research. It's pretty interesting. But then there was a Black woman, I think from somewhere in Africa, I don't remember what country. And she made a comment and was like, we've been known that. Like, that's you guys. We eat when we're hungry. We understand that the cycles of, you know, the day kind of align with what our bodies actually need. We eat when it's hottest because we can't work during that time. So that's the time to rest and eat and recharge and refuel. Natural state is completely misaligned with the state that we need to be in to operate in the system. And that is devastating.
Well, and then the I piece, right, of, again, thinking about like our failures of implementing any kind of real DEIA work. I think it was EGO that said something about like, you know, if you're just diversifying your space, but not like changing the conditions, like especially with the racism, right? You're just inviting people into inherently violent spaces, right?
And then so wonder, like, why are people not getting retained? Because you're bringing them into toxic spaces that they can't survive.
And
so
then
they have to leave.
And then inclusion, right? It's like, oh, you're included. But like a lot of folks, again, looking critically at the whole system and be like, I don't want to be included in this.
And also, why do you get to dictate when I'm included or not?
Like, man, this whole situation is just, and inclusion looks like, we're going to have tacos at the event, you know, like, So that translates to inclusion. But the fact that, again, we can't even talk about that.
I still think it's wild how little people are talking about these very serious things that are happening in our world. The genocide in Palestine, very clearly happening. Other countries in the world have started to speak out about it and saying, like, this is unacceptable. We're going to set sanctions. Like, there's all this stuff, right? The ICE stuff and the deportations that are happening, the way that these people are being put into what will likely be concentration camps. And we're all just sitting here, like, watching it happen on our TVs, on our phones. And
the white lash after the
it's
movement
wild
for Black Lives and people rising up, you know, the refusal to acknowledge that, like, COVID was real and is real. I mean, they just defunded both of the vaccines that were almost complete, right, for things like HIV and tuberculosis, right? So we really have to start using that language of eugenics again, too, and thinking about, again, when we're in these spaces, how do you resist? How do you have those conversations? And we want to hear from you about this stuff, because
we don't
really, we obviously we have opinions, but really we're just being curious, because I think we both feel like we tried all the things. We tried to, like, do the things that they tell you to do.
Both the right and wrong way.
But it would be, like, so disruptive for me to continue to be in these meetings where my students were experiencing all this erasure. And I would be like, hey, what about these students? You know, can we talk about, with all the intersections of identity, like, those are also student parents, right? Can we think about their needs a little bit? And that was like, there goes Chelsea again. Oh, and I'm like, again, I'm just trying to, like, what my purpose is in this space. And so really thinking about this work, right? How are you existing in DEIA spaces, or whatever they're framing that on your campus, right? If you're in, you know, a pride center, if you're in a dream center, if you're in, you know, an emojo or program focusing on Black success, you know, if you're serving parents, and, like, what does that look like where you're at? Because we would love to know. Again, we want to do that more of the raising your mug, right? Like, who's doing this right? And what does that look like?
And maybe not even right, but just effectively.
Yeah.
Like, who is doing something? Yeah, the bar's in hell.
Yeah. And we're talking about really the higher level folks, right? Like, who is moving in a way where they're making decisions, where they're acknowledging and listening to the voices of the students, of the front facing staff, where we're acknowledging our history and our present. We're being bold about that. And we're being courageous about it, and we're operationalizing, right? Because, again, I'm still trying to learn and look for all those models of,
and we'll continue to.
Yeah, more liberatory spaces.
We want to hear from you. What are you all doing that you feel is working, that is moving the needle in some type of way that actually positively impacts the way that the work is being done?
Yeah. So we want to raise our mug. I really want to focus on pride, thinking about how many queer folks are trying to exist in these spaces, how many trans folks are trying to exist in these spaces that are seeking safety, right? That are seeking those places of belongingness. A student was advocating for another student, amazing student, that is a trans woman, and she was just facing all this, like, nasty exclusion, very overt, in spaces that were really dedicated to, like, student success, right? There were those excellence, you know, those honor societies. And just thinking about how painful that is, right? To finally, you know, make it into that as first gen, as, you know, all the layers, all her intersectional identities, to make it into those spaces, and then to still face that kind of rejection and erasure, right? Like, I want to raise my mug to her, because, damn, when we are at these graduations talking about all those ceremonies, all those students that were, like, honoring and loving and supporting and cheering on. And then I also can't think of all the ones that we lost, you know, because we did not do the things that we said we would do. We did not create the kind of spaces. So for folks that are existing in those spaces, like, damn, I'm raising my mug. And then the folks that are choosing to walk away. This country like problematizes quitting, but man, sometimes you just got to quit some shit.
I love quitting stuff.
It's great.
I keep saying it. I
it's
love
so
it.
underrated. So if you had to walk away for self-preservation, right? I want to acknowledge that too. And I want to acknowledge, you know, all of our First Nations people, our Indigenous and Native folks that are suffering and hurting, all the, you know, murdered and missing women that like thinking about erasure in the media, right? And how important it was to have somebody like Jonathan Joss as a representative of that community in a very visible way, and how painful that is. You know, it always feels like losing somebody you knew that you didn't really know. So not raising our mug in a celebratory way, but raising our mug to people that are stepping into their grief and holding space for one another and for their communities in those moments, because that's really what we're just trying to do.
Yeah, who are staying
like,
rooted in their humanity, and like their connection to each other, and recognizing the power of that.
Yeah. And that I'm not free until you're free.
Right.
I'm not free until you're free, right? Really engaging in that work, even if it's just creating a circle of care or going through ceremony. That is an affront to white supremacy, right? That is DEI in action, just you living in this context. So, yeah. Whew. It just got all like misty. Heavy.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah.
Raise our mug to all of you.
All of you for tuning in.
And all of us trying to do the right thing.
Yep.
Right now, it's what we have.
Yep.
And that is resistance.
Yep. And remember, my mug today has brass knuckles because love has teeth. Cheers to that. So subscribe, tune in, listen, submit your stories, engage. Again, we really want to hear from you. So next episode, we're going to get into the weeds with a couple more of the stories. And we're going to start featuring guests. We've got a couple people that are interested in telling their stories with us.
Get ready, y'all.
Let's go.
Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next week.
See you soon. Be well.